So we've talked about propositions before, but now we want to talk about how to translate regular language propositions into what we call categorical form. And it's important to do that so that when we try to analyze something to see if it's logical, to see if it really makes sense, it's a little bit easier to do because regular language uses lots of other words and adjectives and descriptors and things that really aren't to the point, right? They really are not relevant to the main part of what we're trying to say. So that's what we want to do. We want to translate regular propositions into categorical form. Now, before we do that, let's review real quickly what we're talking about. So here's our little dragon guy, and he says, deductive arguments usually have 3 propositions. So you may hear somebody talk for a long time, but if you can boil it down to 3 propositions, that's what makes up a deductive argument. Of course, the little person in green says, that's good, but oddly specific information for a dragon to know. And apparently the fellow in green has taken a logic class because he goes on to say, those 3 propositions are 2 premises and 1 conclusion. So you want to make sure you're getting this into your notes. Deductive arguments usually have 3 propositions, and those 3 propositions are 2 premises and 1 conclusion. And there's Mr. Dragon over here, and he's thinking, that's good, but oddly specific information for a human to know. Now, most of the time when we're talking or listening to somebody talk, there's lots of extra words. As I said just a moment ago, you've got adjectives and adverbs, and people start and stop, and conversation kind of goes all over the place. So we need to figure out how to take that kind of language, that ordinary language, and bring that into the 2 premises and 1 conclusion form of deductive argument. So let's take a look at an example of what we're talking about. So here's this teacher. She's dressed in gold over on the left-hand side, and she says, all these people like to talk about what makes students successful. Well, let me tell you. Back when I taught school, successful students were all I ever had in class. And since the prepared ones were the only ones I ever taught, it stands to reason that successful students are prepared students. And a little guy in blue is thinking, how can I make sense of all she is saying? I mean, she said a whole bunch of stuff, and now he's got to try to figure out how to bring that into categorical form so that he can analyze it more easily. So Mr. Dragon comes back and he says, first, see if you can identify the propositions. And he makes it very clear. He says, they will be sentences with a subject term, a form of the verb to be, which is called a copula, and a predicate term. And again, if you need to pause the video while you take notes, be sure to do that. But propositions really have 3 parts to them. A subject term, a form of the verb to be, and we're talking things like is, are, am, was, were, things like that. And the particular way we describe that in logic, we call that the copula. Think couple, right? When you couple things, you put them together. And that's what verbs like is, are, was, were, that's what they do. They couple parts of the sentence. So you've got the subject term, the copula, and a predicate term. Now, you may think you already know what those are from English grammar, but we want to be very clear here. So our little fellow in green comes back and he says, just as in English grammar, the subject term is what the subject or the sentence is about. In regular grammar, the predicate is simply the verb of the sentence, but in logic, the predicate term is what comes after the verb. So you want to be very clear. The subject term is just like it is in English grammar, right? It's what the sentence is about. But we use the phrase predicate term a little bit differently in logic. In regular grammar, the predicate is just the verb. But in logic, it's what comes after the verb. The predicate term does not include the verb. Then our logic dragon comes back, and he says the next step is to find the 2 premises and the conclusion. And he says premises may have indicators like since, because, for these reasons, etc. And I'll tell you that premises don't always have that, but sometimes they do, and that can help you find what the premises are in a longer conversation or piece of text. And Logic Dragon goes on to say a conclusion may have indicators like therefore, thus, so, in conclusion. And again, the conclusion may not have those indicators, but often they do. And finally, our little fellow in green comes back and he says, finally, pull out the three propositions and arrange them so that you have two premises followed by one conclusion. So as you're trying to analyze what someone has said, you're looking for three propositions and you want to then arrange them so that you have the two premises first and then one conclusion. So now that they've kind of explained what that's all about, let's actually give that a try. Let's actually see what that looks like, trying to analyze something from a longer conversation. So let's go back to the teacher here in gold. And we've got the same bit of text that she had spoken before, but honestly, we could just draw a line through all that first part about these people like to talk about blah, 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 back in my day, let me tell you, blah, blah, blah. We don't need all that, right? That's just extra information, so we can just cross that out. And the first proposition really is successful students were all I ever had in class. And that fits the pattern, right? Successful students would be the subject term. That's what that part of the sentence is about. Were is a copula because it's a form of the verb to be. And then all I ever had in class, that's what follows the verb. That makes up the predicate term. Then we go on and we see the rest of her sentence. She says, since the prepared students were the only ones I ever taught. And we've got another proposition here. And we got one of those clue words, since. All right, so that tells us it's going to be one of the premises. And again, we've got a subject term, the prepared students. We've got the copula were, and then we've got the predicate term, the only ones I ever taught. And then finally, we come to the last part of what she said, and that's also a proposition. It stands to reason. There's one of our signal words that we've got a conclusion here. That successful students are prepared students. And once again, we've got our subject term, successful students. We have our copula are, and we have our predicate term, prepared students. And then doing what the little fellow in green said, we pull all that out and we stack it up, right? We pull out the two premises and the conclusion, and we see premise number one, successful students were all I ever had in class. Second premise, the prepared students were the only ones I ever taught. The conclusion that comes from that, successful students are prepared students. So that's kind of how you would do it, but I want to make sure we're really clear. So we're going to go back and just review some of the basic terms. You want to make sure, again, that you've got these in your notes so that as we go from here, we've really got something that we can build on. So Mr. Logic Dragon has the same idea. He says, let's review. The categorical form of a proposition must have a subject term. That's what the sentence is about. A copula, which is a form of the verb to be, and a predicate term. That's the part that comes after the copula. And our little fellow in green adds a little bit more. He says you can shorten that by saying that the categorical form of a proposition must fit the pattern S is P, where S is the subject term and P is the predicate. Now that's kind of making it almost like mathematics, right? Math really is about symbols. We call them numbers, but they're really symbols. And so he said you're really just breaking down language so that if you can get it into the form S is P, subject is predicate, that's getting it into categorical form so that you can really analyze it and do something with it. Just take it as an example. One day I was out in the park with my rabbit and we were playing around. My rabbit was hopping and I was throwing frisbee. I looked over and I saw somebody eating pizza. And I went up to that person and said, hey, could I have a slice? Well, that's a great story, but that is certainly not a categorical proposition, right? That sentence just kind of rambled on and did a whole bunch of stuff. But if I wanted to say something in a categorical form, I could say something like, rabbits are cute. Pizza is tasty. The beach was sunny. Now I've got it in that categorical form. I can do something with those propositions, and I can actually make premises and a conclusion.